The cruelest thing a man can do is laugh at the woman who once believed in him. Beneath the gold glow of the chandeliers at the Astoria Crown, where crystal flutes caught the light like tiny stars, and every table shimmered with white roses and polished silver, Naomi Carter sat beside her husband and realized that humiliation could arrive dressed in tuxedos and diamonds. The annual Sterling Foundation dinner was the kind of Manhattan event people waited all year to attend. A room filled with hedge fund partners, charity board members, fashion editors, and old money families who spoke in soft voices and judged with their eyes. Naomi wore a black silk gown that fell with quiet elegance around her shoulders, the kind of dress that never begged to be noticed because it already knew its worth. A slim diamond ring rested on her finger, catching the light every time she lifted her glass. And for most of the evening she had done what she had trained herself to do for 3 long years beside Ethan Sterling. Smile with grace, speak only when needed, and make his world look gentler than it truly was. Then Ethan rose for his toast. The room softened into expectation, forks paused over dessert plates, and every face turned toward the heir to one of the most admired financial empires in the city. He stood there with one hand in his pocket, and the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no often enough. A few people laughed before he even spoke, ready to be charmed. Ethan lifted his glass and thanked the donors, thanked the board, thanked the press, and then, with a smile that cut deeper because it looked so effortless, he said that some things in life lasted longer than expected: bad market cycles, awkward speeches, and, in his case, marriages that had begun as social obligations and somehow overstayed their welcome. A ripple moved through the room. It started as surprise, then turned into the thin, uncomfortable laughter of people who did not know whether they were witnessing a joke or a confession. Naomi did not move. She felt every eye in the room brush against her face, her ring, her silence. Somewhere to her left, a woman lowered her champagne flute too slowly, watching. Somewhere near the stage, a younger guest smirked as if this were the kind of cruelty wealth made acceptable. Ethan did not look at Naomi. That was the worst part. He said it like she was not a woman sitting 3 feet away, but a chapter he had already outgrown. For one suspended second, the sound in the ballroom seemed to drain away, and Naomi could hear only the faint clink of ice in a glass and the steady, dignified beat of her own heart. She smiled then, but it was no longer the patient smile of a loyal wife. It was smaller, quieter, almost solemn, as though something inside her had finally stopped pleading to be loved properly. She placed her napkin beside her untouched dessert, folded her hands in her lap, and looked across the room without blinking. The chandeliers still glittered. The violins still played. The guests still pretended elegance could excuse disgrace. But beneath the white light and the practiced glamour, Naomi Carter crossed a line no one else could see. She was still sitting at Ethan Sterling's table. She was still wearing his last name. But in the silence after his laughter, she had already begun to leave. In the long Blacktown car that carried them home through the midnight shine of Park Avenue, Naomi Carter sat with her hands folded over the small silver clutch in her lap and watched the city pass by in reflections of glass and rain. New York looked almost unreal at that hour, all polished towers and red taillights, as if the entire island had agreed to keep sparkling no matter what broke inside it. Ethan sat across from her, one arm stretched along the seat, loose and careless in the aftermath of his own performance, as though the evening had been a success. He did not apologize. He did not even seem to think he should. The scent of his cologne still lingered in the quiet space between them, expensive and familiar and suddenly unbearable. Naomi kept her face turned toward the window because she knew that if she looked at him too soon, he would mistake her silence for weakness again. For 3 years, Ethan had made that mistake. He had mistaken her restraint for dependence, her grace for surrender, her loyalty for a lack of options. He had married her when the papers called it a surprising match, the billionaire heir and the woman who seemed to appear from nowhere with a calm smile and old-fashioned elegance. At first, the attention had felt almost kind. Photographers praised her beauty. Society pages called her poised. Women at charity luncheons leaned in just close enough to ask where she had gone to school, which family she came from, who her people were. And when Naomi answered with warmth but not much detail, they smiled in that polished Manhattan way that meant they had learned exactly what they wanted to know. She did not belong to their world by blood, so they assumed she did not belong there at all. Ethan had never defended her from that. In the beginning, Naomi told herself he was private, that he disliked gossip, that he would show his support in ways that mattered more. But time had a way of removing the silk from excuses and revealing the hard shape underneath. He corrected her lightly in public, dismissed her opinions at dinners, forgot promises he had made when no one was listening, and let other people reduce her to a beautiful accessory attached to his last name. Even his mother, with her pearls and perfect posture, treated Naomi like an elegant error the family had not yet managed to erase. Naomi had endured it with a dignity so consistent that people began to think it cost her nothing. What none of them understood was that dignity was often the most expensive thing a woman could afford. She had not stayed because she was blind. She had stayed because she had once believed that patience could warm a cold man, that loyalty could teach him reverence, that love, if offered cleanly enough, might eventually be returned with care. But there in the car, with the glow of the city sliding over the diamond on her finger, she understood something with a clarity so sharp it almost felt peaceful. Ethan had not humiliated her because he was angry. He had humiliated her because he believed he could. When they reached the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, the doorman greeted them by name, and the elevator rose in quiet luxury toward a home that had never truly felt like hers. Ethan loosened his bow tie and poured himself a drink before she had even taken off her heels. Then, with the casual arrogance of a man certain the night would end like every other night, he said she should not look so wounded because everyone had known it was only a joke. Naomi turned slowly, her expression calm enough to unsettle him. She slipped the wedding ring from her finger, held it for one still second under the soft kitchen light, and set it carefully on the marble counter between them. Not dropped, not thrown, not offered back in anger. Placed there with the precision of a final truth. Ethan stared at it, then at her, as if this were the first language she had ever spoken that he did not understand. Naomi picked up her clutch, her voice low and steady when she finally answered. She said, "You laughed because you thought I would stay no matter what." Then she walked past him, through the silent hall lined with curated art and framed black and white photographs, and into the bedroom where the first life she had built around him was already beginning to close. Naomi did not cry after she closed the bedroom door. That was the first thing that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew her. In the stillness of the penthouse, with the city glowing beyond walls of glass and the distant hum of traffic rising from Fifth Avenue like the pulse of a restless machine, she moved with a calm so complete it almost felt ceremonial. She stepped out of her heels and set them side by side near the velvet bench at the foot of the bed. She unclasped the diamond earrings Ethan had given her the year his company opened its London office and placed them in their lacquered box. One by one, she removed the details of the life she had worn so beautifully that people mistook it for happiness. The room around her was every shade of expensive restraint, cream silk drapes, pale rugs, brushed brass lamps, a closet lined with designer labels and leather cases, a life arranged to suggest security. But security without respect was only another kind of trap, and Naomi saw that now with a painful, almost elegant clarity. She opened the closet and reached not for the gowns or the handbags or the carefully chosen pieces Ethan had once insisted suited her new life, but for a dark cashmere coat, a soft sweater, and the old leather weekender she had owned before she ever learned how to smile for photographers. She packed lightly because she understood something most people in that world never did. When a woman leaves with her dignity intact, she does not need to carry much else. Outside the bedroom, she could hear Ethan moving through the apartment, the slow, impatient rhythm of someone no longer certain he was in control. Once or twice he paused near the door, as though waiting for her to come out calmer, smaller, ready to negotiate the terms of her own humiliation. Naomi gave him no such moment. Instead, she crossed to the back of the closet and knelt before the lowest drawer, the one no housekeeper touched because she had always handled it herself. Beneath folded scarves and a winter shawl lay a slim navy folder, worn at the edges, tied with a ribbon she had not untied in years. She lifted it with both hands and carried it to the bed. Inside were the papers of a life Ethan had never bothered to ask about in full. Diplomas with honors, letters on formal stationery, a fellowship offer from Boston she had declined. Notes from professors who had once called her one of the most brilliant strategic minds they had taught. And at the very bottom, there was the business card she had kept through every move, every gala, every quiet compromise she had made in the name of love. Madeline Pierce. Pierce Global Capital. Senior Managing Partner. Naomi looked at the card for a long time, her thumb resting over the embossed lettering, and memory returned not as regret, but as recognition. Before she became Mrs. Ethan Sterling, she had been Naomi Carter, the woman certain enough of her own future to walk into rooms full of men twice her age and leave with their respect. She had not lost that woman. She had only buried her beneath patience, beneath polish, beneath the exhausting labor of making a cold marriage look gracious from the outside. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. Ethan. Then again. And again. Naomi let the screen go dark each time. She was not interested in the version of remorse that arrived only after consequences did. Instead, she opened her contacts, found a number she had never deleted, and pressed call before she could allow memory to soften her resolve. The line rang twice. A woman answered with the alert warmth of someone who had always spoken as if the world were moving quickly. When Naomi heard the familiar voice, something steadied inside her. Madeline said her name with genuine surprise, then pleasure, and Naomi, standing in the center of the bedroom she was about to leave behind, asked if the offer she had once turned down had truly expired, or if some doors in this city could still be opened by the right woman at the right time. There was a pause, then a low laugh filled with admiration rather than pity. Madeline told her to come in first thing in the morning and to bring whatever she had been too wise to throw away. Naomi ended the call and looked around the room one last time. The framed photographs, the folded monograms, the silver brush on the vanity, the skyline Ethan had once claimed was the only view worth waking up to. None of it held her now. She zipped the bag, slipped the folder inside, and walked back into the apartment with a quiet strength that changed the air before she even spoke. Ethan was standing near the marble island, one hand braced against the counter, the wedding ring still lying where she had left it under the pale kitchen light. He turned as if ready with a sharper sentence, a smoother lie, or perhaps the first apology of his life that cost him something. But Naomi did not stop long enough to hear it. She picked up her coat, met his eyes, and in that final glance gave him the one thing he had never earned from her again, distance. Then she stepped toward the elevator carrying one bag, one folder, and the first clear shape of the woman she was about to become. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the city had traded its midnight glamour for a colder kind of ambition, all sharp sunlight on glass towers and hurried footsteps over polished stone, and Naomi Carter stepped out of a yellow cab in Lower Manhattan with her coat buttoned high, her weekender in one hand, and the navy folder tucked beneath her arm like proof that a buried life could still be claimed. The building that housed Pierce Global Capital rose in clean lines of steel and mirrored windows, elegant without needing to announce itself, the kind of place where power did not sparkle for attention because it had nothing to prove. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of espresso and expensive paper. Men and women in tailored suits crossed the marble floor with badges clipped at the waist and phones pressed to their ears, all of them moving with the precise urgency of people whose time had value. Naomi paused for only a second before walking toward the security desk, and in that brief stillness, she understood how much of herself had returned overnight. She was nervous, yes, but it was the kind of nervousness that lived beside purpose, not beneath fear. When the elevator doors opened on the 37th floor, she stepped into a world of glass conference rooms, muted artwork, and quiet concentration, where market numbers drifted across large screens and assistants spoke in low voices that carried more discipline than drama. Madeline Pierce was waiting near the end of the corridor in a dove-gray suit and low heels, silver at her temples and fierce in the way only certain women became after building themselves in places that had once doubted them. She did not greet Naomi with sympathy. She greeted her with respect. That alone nearly undid something in Naomi, but she held steady as Madeline embraced her once, lightly, then leaned back to study her face with a knowing warmth. Madeline said she had expected Naomi to return to the world eventually, but not that she would arrive looking quite so calm after what must have been a difficult night. Naomi answered that calm was sometimes what remained after illusion burned out. Madeline smiled at that, then led her into a private office overlooking the East River, where the morning light poured across a walnut desk and made the city seem less like a maze and more like a map. They sat, and Naomi placed the navy folder between them. Madeline opened it slowly, reading page after page in the silence of someone rediscovering a rare asset she had once been wise enough to recognize. The degrees, the recommendations, the fellowship, the early strategy work Naomi had completed before marriage had redirected her life. By the time Madeline finished, the expression in her eyes had shifted from welcome to certainty. She said what Naomi had done 3 years ago by stepping away from finance had baffled half the people who understood talent, and now that she was here, she needed to know one thing only. Was Naomi returning? Because she was wounded, or because she was ready? Naomi looked past the glass for a moment at the river flashing in the distance and the tugboats cutting white lines through the gray-blue water. Then she answered with a steadiness that surprised even her. She said she was not there to hide from humiliation. She was there because she had spent too long making herself smaller for a man who needed admiration more than partnership, and she was finished offering her gifts to a life that had never honored them. Madeline leaned back, folded her hands, and nodded once as if a final test had been passed. She said good, because wounded people chase distraction, but ready women build kingdoms. Then she slid a slim file across the desk and told Naomi there was a distressed luxury retail group on the edge of collapse, badly managed, underestimated by competitors, and dismissed by men who only understood obvious power. It needed someone with instinct, patience, and the ability to see value where arrogant people saw weakness. Naomi placed her hand on the file and felt something open inside her. Not revenge, not anger, but alignment. For the first time in years, the room around her did not ask her to be decorative, agreeable, or quiet. It asked her to be brilliant. And when she lifted her eyes to meet Madeline S., the woman looking back at her was no longer merely leaving a marriage behind. She was stepping toward the life that had been waiting for her all along. Over the next 6 months, New York moved through its seasons with the indifference of a city that had seen every kind of rise and fall. But for Naomi Carter, each week carried the quiet precision of a woman rebuilding from the inside out. She took the temporary apartment Madeline arranged on the Upper East Side, a sunlit space with tall windows, pale wood floors, and almost no decoration beyond a reading lamp, a long mirror, and a dining table that quickly disappeared beneath research reports, legal binders, and market analyses. Her days began before dawn with coffee, financial statements, and the kind of silence that sharpened thought instead of feeding loneliness. The distressed retail group Madeline had handed her looked, on paper, like a polished disaster. Luxury stores with famous names were bleeding cash, leadership had confused image with strategy, and competitors were already whispering that the company would be sold in pieces before the year ended. But Naomi saw what other people missed. She saw loyal customers neglected rather than lost. She saw heritage brands mismanaged rather than worthless. She saw possibility buried beneath vanity, which was a language she had learned to translate with painful fluency. In conference rooms lined with glass and winter light, she spoke with a restraint that made men lean forward. She did not dominate conversations. She clarified them. She identified the leaks, the false assumptions, the emotional decisions dressed up as executive confidence. By the second month, even the analysts who had first mistaken her elegance for softness had begun to wait for her final assessment before offering their own. By the fourth, vendors responded to her calls first. By the sixth, the same industry people who had barely remembered Ethan Sterling's wife now spoke Naomi Carter's name with a new note in their voice, the unmistakable tone reserved for a person whose judgment had begun moving markets. Across town, Ethan told himself he was relieved. That was the story he repeated to friends over scotch, to colleagues over lunch at private clubs, and to himself on the nights when the penthouse felt too silent to ignore. He said Naomi had always been too sensitive, too polished, too difficult to read. He said the separation was cleaner this way. He said freedom suited him. And for a while, his life seemed to agree. There were charity dinners he attended alone, women who laughed too quickly at his jokes, weekend headlines about acquisitions, expansion, and the future of Sterling Capital under his leadership. But power, like marriage, could be weakened by the things a man treated carelessly. Ethan had begun making decisions with the same arrogance he once brought to his vows. He dismissed senior advisors who questioned him, pursued a flashy real estate play in Miami that looked impressive in magazines but rested on unstable numbers, and ignored early warnings because caution bored him. In the boardroom, his confidence was still attractive. In the balance sheets, it was beginning to look expensive. Naomi heard about Sterling Capital the way powerful people hear about weather, not because they ask, but because conditions announce themselves. A partner mentioned rising concern over leverage exposure. An editor at a business dinner hinted that the Sterling name no longer carried quite the same aura of certainty. Madeline, studying a briefing book one evening under the soft gold light of her office, glanced up and remarked that Ethan was behaving like a man who had spent too many years being forgiven by the room. Naomi did not answer at first. She stood at the window with the city opening beneath her in ribbons of light, one hand wrapped around a glass of sparkling water, her reflection clear against the darkening skyline. She felt no satisfaction in his instability, only recognition. Ethan had built parts of his life on the assumption that charm could rescue character. Now the numbers were beginning to demand substance instead. Meanwhile, the retail group Naomi had restructured announced its first profitable quarter in nearly 2 years. The market responded with surprise, then admiration. Business journals praised the turnaround as disciplined, elegant, and unexpectedly visionary. Investors who once chased louder names now requested meetings with the woman who seemed to understand both prestige and practicality, both risk and restraint. She accepted only the meetings that mattered. She wore cream, charcoal, and black, spoke in measured sentences, and never once explained herself through the ruins of her marriage. She did not need to. Her work was becoming its own language. One evening, as spring rain traced silver lines down the windows of her apartment and a fresh stack of deal notes waited on the table, Naomi received a cream envelope embossed with gold lettering. The Whitmore Children's Foundation Spring Gala. Attendance by invitation only. Guest of honor to be announced. She almost set it aside with the rest of the social obligations she no longer cared to perform, until a smaller card slipped from the envelope and landed face-up against the table. We would be honored to welcome Ms. Naomi Carter as our keynote benefactor. She read the line once, then again, and in the stillness that followed, she understood that some rooms did not open to the woman who had been humiliated beneath chandeliers. They opened to the woman who had learned how to become the light in them. The Whitmore Children's Foundation Gala was held at the Harrington, a restored Beaux-Arts hotel overlooking Central Park, where Old Manhattan still knew how to wear grandeur without apology, and by 7:30 that evening the lobby had filled with men in black tuxedos, women in silk and diamonds, and the low-polished murmur of people who believed influence should never need to raise its voice. Ethan Sterling arrived just after the first round of champagne had been passed, his tuxedo perfect, his expression composed, the practiced image of command still intact from a distance. Yet beneath the tailored ease of him there was a strain no one unfamiliar with him would have noticed, a thin tension around the eyes, the kind a man carried when too many private cracks had begun appearing behind public glass. Sterling Capital had spent the last month answering difficult questions with confident language and carefully staged optimism. Ethan had told himself the pressure was temporary, that one decisive quarter could reverse sentiment, that the world still worked the way it always had for men like him. He had not expected the evening to unsettle him. He had expected another charitable performance, another room where his name still opened conversations and softened judgment. Instead, from the moment he stepped beneath the vaulted ceiling and into the gold light of the reception hall, he sensed that the room was tilted towards something else, some anticipation he could not yet name. Guests turned their heads not when he entered, but intermittently toward the grand staircase at the far end of the room, where soft candlelight rose in tiers around white peonies and polished brass. There was a hum in the air, subtle but unmistakable, the way a crowd changes when it is waiting for a presence rather than merely an event. Ethan accepted a glass he did not want and exchanged greetings he barely heard. A foundation trustee spoke to him about donor commitments. A real estate developer mentioned the Miami market with careful neutrality. A journalist smiled too brightly and asked whether Sterling Capital planned to comment on restructuring rumors. Ethan answered each one with that same controlled charisma that had carried him through boardrooms and interviews for years, but he could feel his confidence slipping at the edges. Then the room shifted all at once. Not loudly, elegantly, like a tide turning. Ethan looked toward the staircase and saw her. Naomi descended with one hand resting lightly on the railing. Dressed in white, so pure it seemed to gather the light rather than reflect it, the gown cut with quiet precision, long and fluid and impossibly graceful against her dark skin, every step unhurried, every line of her posture serene. She wore no statement necklace, no theatrical display of triumph, only diamond studs, a slim bracelet, and the composure of a woman who had stopped asking permission to exist beautifully in a room that once underestimated her. For one suspended moment, the years he had spent beside her collapsed into a single brutal truth. He had never really seen her. Not like this. Not fully. Conversations around him softened into admiration. He heard her name once, then again, carried across the room by voices that now spoke it with reverence. Naomi Carter, the woman behind the Whitmore Endowment. Naomi Carter, the strategist who had revived Arden Luxury Group. Naomi Carter, Madeline Pierce's most formidable new partner. Ethan stood still as guests began moving toward her, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Many had spent months trying to impress angled themselves to greet her. Women whose approval had once ruled social seasons welcomed her with warm certainty. Even the press kept a tasteful distance, aware that some power was best observed with restraint. Naomi reached the final step and smiled, not the smile of a woman dazzled by attention, but of a woman entirely at ease with what she had earned. Madeline appeared beside her in silver and black, proud without being possessive, and together they crossed into the center of the ballroom as though they had always belonged there. Ethan had imagined many versions of seeing Naomi again. Hurt, bitter, defensive, perhaps even eager for his attention despite everything. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined being the one left standing on the edge of the room while she became its axis. When Naomi finally turned in his direction, it did not feel like a dramatic confrontation. It felt worse. It felt measured. Her eyes met his for the briefest second across the sea of candlelight and crystal, and in that glance there was no pleading, no accusation, no fragility left for him to hold over her. There was only calm, and that calm exposed him more completely than anger ever could. Ethan lowered his glass without realizing it. Around them, the orchestra drifted into a soft arrangement of strings. Waiters moved with trays of sparkling water and champagne, and the chandeliers threw warm light over the polished floor, but to Ethan, the room had narrowed to a single unbearable fact. The woman he had treated like an obligation had returned as a force, and every person who mattered in the room seemed to understand her value before he did. Naomi turned away first, not out of cruelty, but because she had no reason to linger in a moment she had already outgrown. And as applause rose near the stage for the keynote benefactor the foundation had chosen to honor, Ethan Sterling understood that the night was no longer arranged around his name. It belonged to the woman he had once believed would remain small enough to lose. Naomi's voice carried through the ballroom with the kind of calm that made people listen more closely, not because she was loud, but because every word seemed chosen with care. She spoke about the Whitmore Children's Foundation, about scholarship access, long-term mentorship, and the dignity of giving children not pity, but real opportunity. The room answered her with sustained applause, and Ethan stood among the guests feeling, for the first time in years, what it meant to be irrelevant in a space he once controlled by instinct alone. He remained until the end of the speech, through the final round of applause, through the movement of waiters refreshing glasses and trustees rearranging themselves around donors, through the elegant rhythm of a night that had turned into a public confirmation of everything he had failed to understand in private. Later, in the quieter edge of the reception hall, Ethan was approached by Charles Whitmore, a man in his late 60s whose family name carried enough weight to shift conversations on Wall Street with a single phone call. Charles greeted him with polished courtesy, then glanced toward Naomi, who was speaking with a circle of investors near the windows overlooking the park. There was genuine admiration in his expression when he remarked that Ethan had once been married to a remarkable woman. The sentence was simple, but it landed with more force than accusation. Ethan answered with a controlled smile that did not reach his eyes. Charles, either unaware or too honest to soften the point, continued by saying Naomi had the rarest combination in business: intelligence without vanity, authority without performance, and discipline without cruelty. Then, in the tone of a man discussing facts rather than gossip, he added that Pierce Global Capital had been quietly acquiring strategic positions around several struggling luxury assets, including one property portfolio Sterling Capital had recently tried and failed to secure. Ethan felt the air change around him. He asked what Naomi had to do with that deal, and Charles gave him a look of mild surprise before saying she had designed much of the restructuring thesis herself. Not advised it. Built it. Ethan stood very still after that, the sounds of the gala blurring around him into crystal, strings, and distant laughter. He had known Naomi was doing well. He had seen headlines, heard her name, watched people in his own circles begin pronouncing it differently. But this was something else. This was influence threaded directly through the same financial world he had once assumed belonged to him by inheritance and nerve. It became worse on Monday morning. In the Sterling Capital boardroom, beneath recessed lights and a screen filled with red figures, Ethan listened as his chief financial officer outlined the firm's growing exposure and the rising cost of correcting it. One director, careful but firm, asked whether the missed acquisition in the luxury portfolio had created a larger strategic weakness than they first realized. Another mentioned that Pierce Global had moved with unusual precision, as though someone on their side had understood not only the assets, but Sterling's blind spots. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at the report in front of him, at the dates, the valuations, the opportunities he had dismissed because they had not seemed grand enough, immediate enough, flattering enough to his instincts. Naomi had seen value where he had seen inconvenience. She had been doing it for years, he realized. At dinners, in private conversations, in the patient questions he used to wave away. She had always noticed what was unstable beneath polished surfaces. She had always understood systems better than ego. The revelation did not arrive like romance. It arrived like shame. By that evening, alone in the penthouse that still held traces of a life he had not yet learned how to clear away, Ethan found himself standing at the kitchen island where her wedding ring had once rested beneath the pale light. He had put it away months ago, into a velvet box in the study, as if distance could turn consequence into memory. Now he opened the drawer, took out the box, and stared at the ring as though it belonged to evidence from a trial he had only just realized he was losing. It had not been only Naomi's love he had mocked that night at the Astoria Crown. It had been her mind, her devotion, her restraint, her vision, everything in her that had made his world steadier while asking for so little in return. Ethan sat down slowly, the city bright beyond the windows, and understood with a clarity too late to be merciful that the woman he had humiliated had not merely survived without him. She had become more fully herself, and in doing so, she had exposed the poverty of everything he had mistaken for power. 3 days after the gala, Naomi Carter was reviewing a revised expansion proposal in the glass conference room outside her office when her assistant stepped in and said, with careful neutrality, that Ethan Sterling was downstairs asking for 10 minutes. The late afternoon light had begun to turn the city honey gold, casting long reflections across the polished table and the neat stack of briefing books beside her hand. Naomi did not answer right away. She finished the sentence she had been reading, closed the file with measured calm, and looked through the wall of windows toward the river shining beyond Lower Manhattan. Months ago, the thought of Ethan appearing unannounced would have tightened something in her chest. Now it registered as information, nothing more. She asked whether he had an appointment. Her assistant said he did not. Naomi let the silence rest for a moment, then said she would give him exactly 10 minutes, and not 1 second more. When Ethan was shown into her office, he paused just inside the doorway as though the room itself had corrected his posture. It was not grand in the way he preferred. It was refined, deliberate, all warm wood, cream upholstery, fresh lilies, and shelves lined with market histories, architecture monographs, and framed photographs from scholarship events Naomi had funded in recent months. The space did not announce wealth so much as judgment. Ethan wore a navy suit without a tie, polished but tired around the edges, as if sleep had become something negotiated rather than received. For the first time since Naomi had known him, He looked like a man who had run out of easy mirrors. She did not invite him to sit immediately. Instead, she remained standing behind her desk in a cream blouse and charcoal skirt, one hand resting lightly on a folder, her expression unreadable and perfectly composed. Ethan began with the kind of breath a man takes when he has rehearsed pride into humility and hopes it will pass inspection. He said he had tried to call. He said he knew she had every reason not to answer. He said he was not there to cause trouble or to discuss business, only to say what should have been said long ago. Naomi listened without rescuing him from the weight of his own words. At last, she gestured toward the chair across from her and sat as well, not to comfort him, but to let him understand that even mercy now had boundaries set by her. Ethan looked at her for a long second before speaking again, and when he did, the polish in his voice had thinned into something more fragile. He said he had spent months convincing himself that what happened between them had been inevitable, that they had simply grown apart, that ambition and pressure and timing had broken what neither of them knew how to save. But the truth, he admitted, was uglier and simpler. He had been arrogant. He had humiliated her because he believed she would absorb it. He had mistaken devotion for permission. He had taken the steadiness she brought into his life and treated it as if it were owed to him by design. Naomi did not interrupt. Outside the windows, the city moved in slow gold and shadow, ferries crossing the water, headlights beginning to bloom along the avenues below. Ethan said there had not been a single room he had entered since the gala without feeling the shape of her absence in it. He said every recent success of hers had forced him to see not only who she was, but who he had been beside her. Smaller than he imagined. Cruder. Less worthy than the life he had assumed belonged to him. Then his voice lowered, and the final confession came without polish at all. He said he had loved her badly, but he had loved her, and losing her had been the first thing in his life wealth could not negotiate, charm could not soften, and time could not reverse. For a moment, the silence between them became almost tender, not with romance, but with the gravity of truth arriving too late to alter what it exposed. Naomi folded her hands on the desk and looked at him with a calm so complete it left no place for performance. She said she believed him. That was what made the moment more painful, not less. She believed that he regretted it now. She believed that he finally understood the cost. She even believed that, in his own incomplete way, he had once loved her. But love that required humiliation before it learned respect had never been safe enough to build a future on. Ethan lowered his eyes then, as though the sentence had reached somewhere pride no longer could protect. Naomi rose, and after a second, so did he. She walked him to the door herself, not because he deserved ceremony, but because dignity was her habit now, no longer her sacrifice. At the threshold, Ethan turned as if one last appeal still lived in him, but Naomi met his gaze with quiet certainty and said the words he would carry longer than any argument. She told him that the saddest part was not that he had lost her. It was that he only learned her value after she was no longer his to diminish. Then she opened the door, and Ethan Sterling walked out beneath the warm lights of her office, a man finally honest enough to ask for forgiveness, and too late to receive the life he wanted back. In early autumn, the city settled into that brief, luminous season when the light over Manhattan turned soft and golden by late afternoon, and everything old seemed to remember how to look beautiful again. Naomi Carter stood near the window of her office on the 41st floor, watching the trees along the riverfront shift into bronze and amber, while behind her a long table held the final documents for Pierce Global Capital's newest acquisition, a landmark mixed-use property portfolio that would place her name beside some of the most disciplined and influential strategists in the country. There had been congratulations all morning, quiet handshakes, respectful smiles, the kind of recognition that no longer surprised her because it had been built piece by piece, decision by decision, on work that spoke more clearly than wounded pride ever could. Madeline had toasted her at lunch with sparkling water and the dry wit of a woman who considered sentiment most valuable when it was rare. A journalist from a major business magazine had asked for a profile. 2 nonprofit boards had requested private meetings. Investors who once would not have remembered Naomi's face in a ballroom now studied her choices for signs of where the next decade might move. Yet when she looked at the skyline, what she felt was not triumph in the way people often imagined it. It was peace. The kind that comes only after a woman has stopped trying to persuade the world that she deserves respect and begins living as though that fact is no longer under debate. Ethan Sterling remained in the city, of course. Men like him did not vanish. They adjusted, regrouped, hired better advisors, spoke more carefully in public, and learned to carry regret in places nobody could photograph. Sterling Capital had survived, though smaller, quieter, less adored than before. The headlines had softened. The board had tightened its discipline. Ethan had even gained a reputation in recent months for being more restrained, less theatrical, almost thoughtful. Naomi heard these things the way one hears about distant weather. They belonged to a landscape she no longer lived inside. Once, she might have measured healing by whether his name could still disturb her. Now she measured it by something simpler. She no longer imagined what could have been if he had loved her well. That question had lost its power. Late that evening, after the office had thinned into silence and the city below flickered with headlights and window light, Naomi gathered her papers, slipped into her coat, and rode the elevator down alone. Outside, the air carried that first clean hint of fall, crisp against her skin, and the doorman hailed a car, but she found herself choosing to walk instead. She moved north along the avenue beneath rows of glowing street lamps, past restaurants spilling warm light onto the sidewalk, past couples in cashmere and tourists staring upward at buildings older than memory, past the polished windows of stores that once represented a world she had tried so hard to fit into. Now the city felt different beneath her feet. Not more generous, more honest. At a corner near the park, she paused beside a glass storefront and caught her reflection, white blouse. Beneath a camel coat, dark hair touched by the evening breeze, expression composed, eyes clear. For a moment, she simply looked at the woman there. Not the wife who had smiled through insult. Not the woman who had once confused endurance with devotion. Not even the rising power whose name moved through financial circles with new force. Just Naomi. Whole. Self-possessed. Unafraid of the life she had chosen. Her phone vibrated softly in her bag. A message from Madeline asking whether she was ready for next week's conference in Boston. Another from the Whitmore Foundation about a scholarship initiative launching in winter. Then, lower on the screen, unnoticed at first, an old message thread with Ethan, quiet for months, his last words still sitting there like something history had failed to erase. Naomi looked at it only briefly before locking the phone and slipping it back into her bag. Some chapters did not need answers. They only needed closure. She resumed walking, her heels steady against the pavement, and when she reached the edge of the park, she lifted her face toward the cool night air as the skyline rose around her in silver and gold. She had not destroyed the man who underestimated her. She had done something far more difficult and far more elegant. She had outgrown the version of herself that once accepted less than reverence. And in that quiet, shining city, with autumn gathering at the edges of the trees and the future opening before her without apology, Naomi Carter understood that her greatest victory was never becoming powerful enough to make him regret her loss. It was becoming whole enough that his regret no longer had the power to define her at all.